What I'd like to have you do is turn with me in your Bibles to the Old Testament book of Esther. I'm going to do something a little bit unusual today. The Old Testament book of Esther is kind of one of those books that you don't hear a lot about. It's a very particular book, but I think for this season of the year, a very good one. This book in the Old Testament is a book that gives the rationale or the reason why God's people for hundreds and hundreds of years have celebrated a particular feast at the end of the year. The name of the feast is called Purim. The Hebrew word Purim means lot. You can think of like a dice. And the idea of the feast is this, that at the end of the year, as we look back over all the events of this previous year, we celebrate the fact that God's totally in control of everything. Not only the big things, but even the little things. You can think about how inconsequential it seems to cast a lot or roll a dice. And the idea of this feast is that we can celebrate that no matter how inconsequential things are, God is totally in control of them. And so when you think of even a dice being rolled and a face turning up, God is there in the midst of the details of our life. And that gives us as His people a lot of hope, because we know that He has a plan and a purpose, so that even in the negative things or the difficult things, He's at work to bring about His plan and purpose. And that's the feast of Purim that was celebrated at the end of every year for God's people. And this book provides the rationale or the reason for that celebration. We're going to start in chapter 1, verse 1. If you didn't have your own Bibles, I invite you to take one out. Turn to page 354. We don't have time to go through everything in this book, so I'm just going to give you the highlights. And hopefully, my hope is that you're really going to catch the overall message as we just go through little by little what this book is all about. We'll start in verse 1. It's a fascinating story. I'll do my best to get you into the details of it. Chapter 1, verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders in Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles, and the provinces were present. Let's just start with a few of those details so we can catch our bearings. About 400 to 500 years before the birth of Jesus, there was an empire that took over the then known world, known as the Persian Empire. And I'm just going to put a map up here on the screen so you get a sense of it. This empire really just took everything over from India all the way down to Cush, which is in Egypt. Jerusalem, Israel, was overtaken by this empire. And there was one man, an emperor, who ruled over it all. This is about 400 to 500 years before the birth of Christ. And the capital city there, you can see just above where it says Babylonia, above the Tigris and Euphrates River, is Susa, and that's where Xerxes, this emperor, reigned. Now, some of the details that these verses specify are important. If you look at verse 2, it says, At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the, it says here, 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, the nobles, and the provinces were present. This story that we're going to read about, the story of Esther, is really a story about how God's in control of it all. And it's set against the backdrop of this Xerxes, a king who, as one man, believed that he was in control of it all, right? He's the emperor of this vast empire. These 127 provinces were all loyal to him. And one of the things that this book does, it almost makes fun of him. Like, oh, you think you're in control? And it paints him as a very, very weak leader. In fact, just even this detail, that it was in the 3rd year of his reign that he gave this banquet. Probably what this means is that this banquet is his inauguration ball. He came to power in the 1st year. People weren't quite aligned with him. It took him up to 3 years to finally get everyone to acknowledge that, yeah, he's the king. There are probably all kinds of plots against him and to get the military aligned to him. So it's in the 3rd year that he decides to hold this big banquet, this big ball, this inauguration event to kind of show off his power and his wealth and what a great emperor he is. Even look at verse 4. It says, For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. He's really trying to show off, like, 180 days worth of just seeing how great I am. Like, he's got some big convincing to do. And just reading on here, when these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink his own way, in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Read, it was a big kegger, okay? Basically, he's got all these nobles and princes from every land, and he, for 180 days, is trying to show off to them, and he's giving them as much booze and liquor as they want. People are getting drunk, plastered out of their minds, and he's trying to show, like, look at what a great guy I am, totally in control of everything. It gets better. He's got a wife. Her name is Vashti. In verse 9, it says, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. This is where the story begins to turn. On the 7th day, so toward the end of this whole thing, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, which is the Bible's way of saying he was drunk like a skunk. I mean, just plastered, right? And he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. How about that for names, right? To bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the peoples and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So you got to catch this picture, right? Here's the king, drunk as a skunk. After 7 days, he's like, man, I want you guys to see my smoking hot wife. I want you to see her. Bring out the queen so everybody can see how awesome I am. Right? She is the only sane one in this book. Refuses to come out. And he is furious. Okay, what does the king do? It says in verse 13, since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were highest in his kingdom. Let's talk about Bible names just for a minute. You like those names? Okay, generally when you're reading through the Bible and you come across a set of names, you struggle to read them because they're totally unfamiliar, right? Why are they unfamiliar? Those names were familiar names to people back then, but no one is called, Carcass anymore today. If you are, I'm sorry. But no one is called that anymore today. But back then, it was maybe popular. However, these names, like scholars have looked, there's nobody ever recorded in Hebrew history that's named these names. And they've looked into Persian history. There's no one in Persian history ever named these names. These are funny names on purpose. Because what the writer of this book wants to do is he wants to let you know that the wise men who understood the time to this weak king are Dumbo, Dingbat, Dopey, Sneezy, Laffy, Coffee, and Dilbert. Right? I mean, it's like they're making fun of these guys. Like they think they're all wise, but they're Dopey and Dingbat and Dumbo and Sneezy. Okay, so they have a plan. Verse 16, Memucan, that's Dilbert, he replies in the presence of the kings and nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong. Not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's noble in the same way. There'll be no end to the disrespect and discord. So they have a plan. Oh, King Xerxes, hear what you need to do. Cast her out. She's no longer queen. And, if you were to read through the end of the chapter, why don't you write a letter to everyone in your empire, and the letter should say, wives, respect your husbands, which is funny coming from Dingbat and Dilbert, right? Like, none of you are laughing, it's funny. So here's Dingbat and Dilbert who are like, our wives need to respect us. It's just that none of the guys want to laugh. I know what's going on here. It's like I've touched on a subject here that's a little difficult for... Okay, anyway, moving on. Chapter 2. Okay, the story goes on. Later, read when he woke up from his drunken stupor, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he decreed about her. It's funny because here's this emperor who rules over the world, and it's very interesting that every time his advisors give him advice, he takes it. He is like the quintessential yes man. He has no decision of his own in this entire book. He always follows people's advice, whether good or bad. And he wakes up the next morning, he's like, what have I done? Now I don't have a queen. So, those wise men, verse 2, come with a solution. The king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So he's a yes man. He just does whatever anyone tells him. Now, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried in exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, along with those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So we're introduced to two of the main characters of this story, Mordecai and Esther. And the story is going to turn on what happens now in their lives. There's a few things just to even note now. This story, you know this phrase that we talk about sometimes as Christians, that we need to be in the world, but not of the world? You know that phrase, right? It describes how we, in our everyday lives, we live in this world. We have to rub shoulders with all kinds of people who are far from God, who do all kinds of things. And we live in this world, but we can't be of the world. And actually, as we talk about God's providence and how he works, there's a commentary, so to speak, in this book about how to be in the world, but not of the world. There's that tension to be had for God's people. And we can just read now that here are two people, Mordecai and Esther, who are maybe not doing the best job of navigating that tension. Just to talk a little bit about their names, because I think their names are important. They are actually named after other gods. One of the Babylonian gods, who was very well known and regarded at that time, was a god named Marduk, from which we get now Mordecai, Marduk. And there was another god, Astarte. He was a Greek and Persian god from which Esther receives her name. So you think about it, here are some of God's people. They're living in the empire of Persia, far from Jerusalem and in the citadel of Susa. And they have to navigate this tension, right? How to be in the world, but not of the world. And although they have other names, they're known most for being Mordecai, Marduk, and Esther, Astarte. And that detail is important because it makes sense of what happens next, because when I read what happens next, you wonder to yourself, like, how could God's people get wrapped up in this thing? And this is what follows. There is a contest. Have you guys ever seen this show? You seen that? I hate this show. I mean, right? Like all these women come, and there's this man, and they all vie for his attention and for his love. Hopefully become his husband. And he, tries them all out. And it's really like a hedonistic romp. Just handing out roses until finally, the lucky girl gets chosen after the other people that he was just whatever with, Anyway, that show, as bad as it is nothing compared to what we find here. So there's this contest, and all these virgins are brought, and the king is going to try them out one at a time. Look with me at verse 12. We'll get some of the overall instructions of how this thing went. Before a girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to take care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So you can imagine how long, like every night there's some new virgin that comes in and he tries her out, and only if he likes her enough and calls her by name will she ever return. Well, Mordecai and Esther get caught up in this. She has become a part of this contest. And look with me at verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the reign of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials, and he proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So she won that season of The Bachelor, right? She is the one. She got that final rose. And you may wonder, how could one of God's people get caught up in it? And that's one of the questions that's here in this book. I mean, she's obviously made mistakes. She's not being faithful to her God. She has a name of a foreign God, and she's doing things that, God's people shouldn't do. But nevertheless, okay, here's how this narrative turns. Of course, in every good story, we need a villain. And by the time we get to chapter 3, we get that villain. But one detail before we meet the villain, here at the end of this chapter in verse 21, it's important for you to know. Again, the king, he thinks he's big stuff, but he's really a very weak man. We get this detail about Mordecai. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. We don't know why. Why did they disrespect this king? Why were they so angry with him? What was it that he was doing that they didn't like? But 2 of his own guards, who are the ones who are closest to him, whose job it is to protect him, are plotting to assassinate and kill him. But Mordecai, verse 22, found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were hanged on a gallows. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So Mordecai, he finds out about this, and he's a loyal servant, and he reveals the plot, and Xerxes' life is spared because of what Mordecai did. It gets written down in his chronicles or annals, which is important. It's an important detail for later. Anyway, every good story needs a villain. We now meet the vile Haman. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. So Haman is elevated up and becomes like the top dog. A couple things about Haman. Okay, it says here, and this is an important point in verse 1, that he is the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. Now, if you're really familiar with the Old Testament, this would be an important detail for you. King Agag was the infamous king of a group of people known as the Amalekites, the hated Amalekites. Now, you might not know a lot about the Amalekites, but they are basically known in the Bible as being sucker punchers. Okay, that's what they're known for. They're like the king of sucker punchers. So when Israel was coming up out of Egypt, they had crossed the Red Sea and they had emerged. The first territory they had to pass through was the territory of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites wanted to fight them, but they didn't fight them head on as they were entering. It was only after they left the territory that the Amalekites then attack them from the rear, attacking first the weak women and children who were straggling behind. They threw a sucker punch. And every time you read about the Amalekites in the Bible, they're always throwing sucker punches. So here's the vile Haman, representative of the sucker punchers. And he's going to live up to his name, because that's what he's going to do as well. He has been elevated to this high position of honor. And as we continue to read about him, Haman, his character, he has a big ego. In fact, that's what he's Mr. Ego here. It says in verse 2, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honor, he was enraged. So here's Mordecai, lifted from relative obscurity to become like the top guy in this kingdom, and he is now Mr. Ego. And here it is. It's not enough that now everyone bows down and pays honor to him. You'd think for most people, like, wow, that would be a dream come true, but not for him. The only thing he can think about is that there is this guy, Mordecai, who would not bow down to me. I hate that guy. That's what's going through his mind. And he decides it's not enough for him to just get rid of Mordecai. He's going to get rid of Mordecai and all his people. In fact, it says here in verse 6, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So this is this whole thing. He hates that guy. And he's going to do something about it. And by the way, these next verses we're going to read, they are at the heart of this entire book. Look with me at verse 7. This is his idea. This is what he decides to do. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, it's the first month, so you got to think like it's in January according to our year, they cast the pur, that is the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So here's what's happened. Haman's decided, you know what? We're going to throw a lot. We're going to throw some dice here. And whatever those dice turn up, whatever month, whatever day they turn up, that is the day that we are going to kill Mordecai and all his people. And so they roll the dice, and it turns up the 12th month. It's January now. Come this December, that's where we're going to kill all these people. And if you read through the rest of the chapter, he goes to the king and he says, listen, this is what's happened. And you, O king, should make an edict that on that day in December, all the people everywhere should kill anyone who is one of God's people, any one of the Jews. And the king, who's a weak yes man, just says yes and issues this edict. And so on that day, come December, all God's people are in huge jeopardy. And just to point this out, as this chapter winds up, verse 15, spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. And catch this now, the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. All right, so this is the day that Xerxes and Haman become drinking buddies. Right, everyone's all upset, and they're up there in the palace just throwing back a few, and they are tight. And Haman's ego is like way up to here. I mean, he is the man. Okay? Chapter 4. So Mordecai finds out about this plot, and he is cut to the heart. He dresses in grieving clothes and lies down in ashes. And Esther, who's in the palace, who keeps up with him, sees what's going on, and she thinks, man, you can't be doing that. Here's some better clothes. Put these on. And he sends back word like, no. Don't you know what's going to happen? Here, read this edict. And if you look with me in chapter 4, look beginning in verse 9. Hadath, that's one of the servants, went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So here Esther, she's contemplating like what's going to happen. And she says to herself like, man, my fate could be the same as Vashti's. Like he still has all this other harem for 30 days now. She hasn't been able to go and have relations with him. It's been some other girl. She might think to herself, my position's weak. There's this law in the land. You can't just approach the king. I mean, if you do, you have to be put to death unless he spares your life. And I could die. I want you to hear Mordecai's response and then what follows. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, I'm in verse 13, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. 2 thoughts here, and there are 2 big themes that we're going to return to. The first is the theme of God being totally in control of everything. So up till now, Esther's life has been a very strange life. She's seen a lot of grief, right? She's an orphan, brought up by her cousin. She's lived a questionable life, being caught up in this contest, now become queen. But she finds herself in a position, and she knows that it could cost her her life, but Mordecai points out to her, who knows? But that all this happened according to God's plan, and that you've been raised up to this position at this very moment, he says, for such a time as this. In other words, even through all the bad circumstances, the sin and the difficulties of your life, who knows but that God might have been in charge of it all. And at this moment, right now, you've been put in this place at this time for God's purpose. That's one of the themes, God being totally in control. And then the second thought, Esther says, okay, and if I perish, then I perish. Here we have a story of a girl who finally decides that she is willing to lay down her life, if need be, to save her people. We'll come back to that as well. Anyway, this is how the story goes. On the 3rd day, she approaches the king with the request that she has in mind. And when she gets there, he extends that gold scepter. And, the king must have known, right, that if she was willing to risk her life by coming into his presence uninvited, that she must have some big request. So he's like, okay, what is it, honey? Anything, I'll give it to you. Just tell me what it is. You may wonder to yourself, like, how come she didn't just right then come out with what it was she wanted? But it's probably because she's, from this point forward, is just painted as the most wise, savvy person. She knows her position. Like, Haman is his best friend and drinking buddy. I haven't been called to the king for 30 days. And so she decides, and it's fascinating, she seizes upon the personality traits of these 2 characters, Haman and Xerxes. And this is what she does. She says, listen, here's my request. I'm preparing this banquet, and I want to invite you, O king, and one other person. I want to invite Haman. Now, here's what's going on in the mind of each of these people. When she says that she wants to invite Haman, Xerxes is probably thinking to himself, like, why? What does she want with Haman? What's going on here? Are they behind my back? Is this another attempt, another plot on my life, right? He's had other people plotting against his life before. Are these 2 people who are close to me plotting against my life? Like, what's going on? That's what's happening in his mind. Haman, on the other hand, is like, look at me. I'm the man. Yeah, baby. Only 2 people get to go. It's the king and me. I am so awesome. And so that's what's going on in their 2 minds as they approach the banquet. Mr. Eager and Mr. Insecure. All right, so they approach this banquet, and the king now, he's nervous. Like, what's going on? So he asks her again, like, okay, honey, here we are. Thanks for this banquet, but what do you want? Well, what's your request? What's your question? And she's so wise, so savvy, she still doesn't come out with it. She says, I want to throw a banquet again tomorrow night, and I want 2 people to be there, you, O king, and also Haman. And now you can imagine like how these psychologists get exacerbated. In his mind, he's like, oh my goodness, what is Haman doing? Why is my wife hanging out with him? What is this all about? And Haman's over here like, yeah, buddy, I am awesome. And he walks out, and this is what happens in the middle of chapter 5. He walks out, beginning in verse 9. It says, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. Read, intoxicated. And when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He gets home and he starts telling his family, like, I am so awesome. I'm so rich. You should check out all my money. I'm like so important. You know that when the king and queen hold banquets, I'm like the only invited guest. I am awesome. But then he's like, but I hate that Mordecai. And his family says, well, you know, if you're so awesome, then why don't you just do something? In fact, we'll build these huge 75-foot tall gallows, and why don't you just go to the king and say, hey, I want to get rid of this guy Mordecai. I hate him. And he thinks, good idea. He can't even wait till December to come. He's going to kill him right now. So he starts heading back to the palace. Meanwhile, back at the palace, beginning of chapter 6, says that night, the king could not sleep. Okay, why can't he sleep? He's worried, right? Like, man, there's something going on here. There's a plot underfoot. So he ordered that the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Okay, so here's his thought. I know what I'll do. If there's a plot afoot, I am going to reward, I am going to lift up those who are faithful and expose such plots so that maybe someone else will think that could be me. So he's saying to himself, okay, we got to do something for Mordecai. Just then, Haman arrives. Good, Haman, you're here. Listen, I really want to honor somebody. Haman's thinking to himself like, yeah, baby, that's me. So the king asks, like, what should I do? He's like, you know what you should do? You should throw a parade for that guy. Let him ride on your horse. Put your clothes on him. Let everybody throw him a party and shout at him. He's thinking it's him. The king says, great. Go do that right now for Mordecai. He's like, oh, I hate that guy. Okay, now, the story, it goes on, right? So he goes, he does this whole thing. He's all upset. But then here comes the second banquet. So beginning of chapter 7, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It'll be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be granted. Just what is it? She says, look, here it is. There's been an edict issued that all my people and me are going to be killed in December. The king's like, what? Who's done that? And she says, that vile Haman. You know, everything's been set up now. And the king is enraged. He goes out to think over what should be done because now his drinking buddy has been conspiring to do something horrible. And he goes out in the garden to think about it. And Haman is just like on her couch, like begging her. And he walks back in and thinks that Haman's trying to molest her now. And he's like, all right, that's it. I can't take anymore. What can be done to this guy? And someone points out, he's just built gallows out in his house. Hang him. And there's this stunning reversal. The guy who was threatening to kill Mordecai and all the Jews is hung on his own gallows. And if you were to continue reading the rest of the book, which I wish we had time for, but we just don't, it details that this story that we just talked about is the reason why God's people, at the end of every year in the 12th month, should just throw this huge celebration, and they should celebrate that God is totally in control. You remember these words back in chapter 4? Who knows but that for such a time as this, God has raised you up to this position. And the name of that feast is the Feast of Purim. Remember Pur, the dice? So it'd be like throw the Feast of Lots or throw the Feast of the Dice. What should we remember when we throw the Feast of the Dice? That even the small roll of a dice is totally in God's control. Remember that That even when bad things happen, like, you know her parents had died, she's an orphan. She had made all these wrong choices. But God has somehow used those and woven the details of her life together so that at this point, at this time, he can use her. And as you come to the conclusion of every year, this is what God's people are supposed to remember. Okay, both in the good things that have happened, but also in the bad things, even my own mistakes. Who knows? But here I am right now, and I should recognize that God has been totally in control. And I know we don't celebrate this feast much today, but I think as we come to the conclusion of the year, we should. Right? You look back over all the events of this past year in your own life, both the good and the bad, and just celebrate right now that, you know what? God is totally in control. My life is divinely orchestrated, and I know that the person, the God who began this good work in me is carrying it out to his perfect plan and will, and everything's working according to my good in his plan. And who knows that in your life right now, no matter where you're at, you've been brought to this point at this time, and God's ready to use you. Does that make sense? One more thought. I want to come back to this in chapter 4. Here you have a story of a girl who is willing, if need be, to die on behalf of her people. You think about this whole big idea, this big theme, right? God's in control of everything. Isn't it interesting that as you read through the Old Testament, there's just story after story after story, preparing us to hear the story of one who will come, who's not just willing, but does lay down his life to rescue his people. Like this story ultimately is just a story of the gospel. And especially during Christmas when we think about Jesus coming, right? A light shining in the darkness. When we think about how our sin causes all that darkness, and God just purposed that his son would come to die, to lay down his life so that we could live. There's just one story after the next in the Old Testament that just keeps ringing out to prepare us so that we'll hear this story, the story of Jesus. And ultimately, this is about trusting in him. Trusting in Jesus for the life that he brings, understanding that this was God's plan all along, that he should come and die a death on the cross so that we could live. And if you're here today and you're hearing what I'm saying, then you should understand that there's no accidents. You're here for a reason, and God's brought you for a purpose. And today, if you recognize that this is all about Jesus, if you haven't done so, given your life to him and trusted in him, then there's an encouragement, I think, that comes from God's word, like you can trust him. Give him your life. Give him your heart. It makes all the difference when you know that the events of your life are not coming about by chance. They're not happening randomly. But God has a plan and a purpose for each event that occurs. And as we celebrate Christmas this year, our focus is just upon that God who's doing these good things for us through the person of Jesus. Amen.